Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us today for what I hope will be a very interesting and productive conversation. I'm Jessica Billingsley. I'm CEO and Chair of Akerna, and I am joined today by Gail Rand. Gail, I would love if you would introduce our program.
So today we're going to talk about revenue and profitability, which is my comfort zone. But what's even more exciting is that we're going to have this discussion in the context of gender parity and inclusion. I'm Gail Rand. I'm the CEO and founder of Grand Consulting. I help cannabis and hemp companies understand their financials to make better decisions. I just want to give a special thanks to Arcview and NCIA for sponsoring this important work in this webinar. So let's start with how this project even got started. The whole effort originated with Andrew Klein, the former public policy director for NCIA, who's now in public practice. We then put together an extraordinary team who you will hear from today. So needless to say, the time for gender parity is now. The cannabis industry is still young enough to have an impact, but we need to build a new foundation. Company leaders have an opportunity and an obligation to shareholders, to employees, to customers, and to themselves to focus on gender parity for all people. Time and time again, research has shown that true gender parity, diversity, and inclusion have had huge positive impacts on business, from decision-making, understanding customers, empathetic choices, and of course, on the bottom line. So how did we as authors come together? As I mentioned in the conclusion, when we started this project, we did set to achieve three main goals for the process itself. One, we wanted to create a diverse team of industry professionals. Two, we wanted to write this series in an authentic and honest way. And three, we wanted to use research, data, and personal experiences to produce key actionable takeaways and toolkits that are accessible by all levels of team members, from change makers to C-suite executives and board members. So let's go ahead and jump in to meet some of our authors. I'd like to welcome Kelly Perez, Risa Levine, Christine Delarosa, and Elise Serrabioli to join us.
Thank you, Gail.
Thank you, Gail.
So Kelly, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'm Kelly Perez. I'm CEO and co-founder of Kind Colorado, president and co-founder of Cannabis Doing Good, and co-executive director of the Cannabis Impact Fund, doing a couple too many things.
But doing them so well. Risa?
Hey, Gail, thank you. Hey, I'm Risa Levine. I am the chief of staff and a partner at Cohn Resnick, accounting, advisory, and tax organization, provide professional services to the cannabis space.
Christine?
Hello, my name is Christine Delarosa. I'm the CEO and national co-founder of the People's Dispensary and the People's Holdings, and I'm super excited to talk with all of you today about the gender parity papers.
And Elise.
Hi, my name is Elise Serrabioli. I lead global business development at Streamo, the leading ERP cannabis solution. Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you to Arcview and NCIA for hosting this, and to Gail and Jessica for moderating.
Thank you so much, ladies, for joining. We've got quite the powerhouse to get us started. So first, I'd like to direct this question maybe to Christine and Elise. When it comes to leadership and founding members of each company, why are women getting less equity, less power, and less control? What should company ownership and management be doing differently?
Well, I think that there's a lot of reasons that we don't have the same amount of equity. We talk about this in the paper. We talk about the glass ceiling, how a lot of times the way that people get into C-suite positions is their network, right? They're people that know. We also call it the dude bro network, which a lot of us don't belong to. And so not only does your education matter, not only does your experience matter, but having those connections also matters. And so for a lot of women, we don't have those connections. We didn't go to Harvard or Yale, or we don't have, not that everybody comes from Harvard, Yale, but we didn't go to places where you have those connections. We don't go to certain golf clubs or are able to network in the same way that men are. So when you're looking at the C-suite in cannabis and you're looking specifically to add value add of female leadership, you have to look outside of those networks to really find the people that will fit your company culture, but also that will pull your company culture out of that dude bro network, out of that glass ceiling. And it's going to be a little uncomfortable. And if it's not uncomfortable, then you're not doing it right. And so I think that's the biggest reason, is that we don't have access to those kinds of rooms at any given time, and that people that are in those rooms really need to step outside of those rooms and get comfortable with being in the wild.
Thanks, Elise.
I would 100% agree with everything that Christine just said. And from a position of what can companies do, I would recommend to investors, to C-suite leadership, to board members, to really think about how they're extending equity opportunities to co-founders or employees. We expand on that in the equity ownership paper. And something that I just wanted to add is that this is obviously in our interest as women to have these opportunities open to us, but it's also very much in the business's interest. For every dollar that you invest in women-owned startups, there is a much higher return, 78 cents to the dollar versus 31 cents to male-owned startups. That doesn't have to just be startups. Also, companies that have women in leadership prove to be 10% more successful over 5-year periods. So it's in everybody's fiscal interest as well.
Wonderful, thanks so much. Maybe direct this next one to Kelly and Risa. What key actionable takeaway from your paper do you think could have the most impact on companies that have not historically had gender parity but are willing to work for it?
Mm-hmm. Thank you for asking. I mean, we've got to dig deep into the systems of oppression, and that sounds really ethereal, but it isn't. I mean, systemic racism is a gigantic reason why we don't have gender parity, and we experience oppression differently. So it takes leadership, right? It takes a business owner being willing to be courageous and take this cultural touch point that we're in right now, this inflection point, and do your work and learn and make commitments and make sure that your team is aligned with your values. Typically, HR folks, haven't necessarily been trained in revolution-focused policy and business practices, but we are in cannabis. Like, we're change makers. It's what we've always done. So if we can't craft and advise getting to a place where gender parity is, just obviously understood, we're 51% of the population, and you break that down, Black women are like 12.9%. I mean, we all have a responsibility to learn as business leaders and to take a look at the demographics and some of the things that Elise pointed out. I mean, who do we think will be working for us? Who do we think our customer base will be? I mean, we're leaving ideas, creativity, market share on the table. So those aren't good business decisions. So do your work, make sure that you're truly leading, and be shame resilient. You're not necessarily going to do it perfectly every time, but don't harm the messenger for certain when problems are being pointed out, and keep at it. Risa?
So Kelly, I love that. I could just listen to you talk all day. I hear the word oppression, and one of the key takeaways that we talk about is economic oppression, and it shows up in pay equity, pay equality. And that's been since the dawn of time. It is not just in cannabis. I come to this with an industry agnostic lens. But when we think about parity, gender parity, economics and the way we're paid is a huge part of what equalizes us in society. We talk about in the pay equity section of the paper, what happens if companies could just take one step back, pause, and do a bit. Just take the time, make the time, really look at how are you paying women in relation to men, looking at like-kind jobs, looking at incentives, looking at what's holding us back. We have seen the statistics. We have all seen the statistics. I read something that Citigroup put together recently. If we keep moving at the pace we are, It'll take us about 257 years to get where we're needing to go. Yet, if we work on this issue right here, right now, there would be, I think the statistic is something like $13 trillion would enter the global GDP by the year 2030 if we could just equalize pay. Imagine that. That's a huge takeaway. And we all can be doing that. And we all should be doing that.
I love that. Thanks. And I think we're going to have to steal Kelly's shame resilient as a hashtag here moving forward, of course, as well.
So I have a question now for Christine and then Elise. How have you incorporated one or maybe more of the key actionable takeaways from this series in your own business?
Well, I think for our business, we started with a social justice, social equity framework. So we built it into the company. And one of the key actionable takeaways, even though we've done that, right? Even though we started that way, that's how we started. I still am looking for ways to make how our framework works even better. We recently asked for Kelly to do a proposal for anti-racist, anti-bias work for the People's Dispensary. And a lot of people would be like, but you're social justice, you're social equity. And yes, we are those things. And also we're not perfect. And I think this is where we really have to start to focus on that we're not perfect. Nobody's perfect. We can always use help. We can always use extra information. And so while we are doing the work, we're also getting help in helping us expand our minds to do the work and helping us expand our business to do the work. And so that to me is a key takeaway, is to really follow the shame resilience that Kelly speaks about, but also to think about you're not perfect, ask for more help, get as much data and information for yourself so that you are building the company you set out to build. And everybody makes mistakes. I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to say right now. Everybody on this call, everybody in the audience, we make mistakes. And the thing is to not be shamed about making the mistake. The thing to do is to figure out how to make sure you don't make mistakes in the future. And I think that that is one of the most important lessons that I've learned in my time in the cannabis industry.
Elise?
Yeah, thank you for that, Christine. It's been an honor working with Christine and learning how the People's Dispensary works and has built their framework from the beginning. I lived in 5 countries on 4 continents, and I've worked in supply chain and technology for a long time pre-cannabis. So I unfortunately have seen a lot of incredibly toxic environments and have often been the only woman in the room. Now transitioning into cannabis, I was very fortunate to start working at Streamo, where the CEO, Helkenberg, is a strong anti-racist and feminist, and has built a very inclusive environment where I feel very comfortable. And she's been doing this work for a while. So when we started writing these papers, and Christine, Kelly, and I were working on the C-suite paper and really built these 3 takeaways of anti-bias training, anti-racism training, and building it into your pipeline. It actually, I didn't do that on purpose, but I was reflecting on that, and I realized, yeah, this is why I feel so safe in the space where I am. And that's why I can focus on my job, because I don't need to focus on the other things that were distracting me before in a more toxic environment.
That's a fantastic perspective of how much of a distraction it can be to your work, to the bottom line, to everything that everybody does. So thank you both for answering that question. So Christine or Kelly, I guess what I'd like to know, one of the things you spoke about in your paper is the role of both training and mentorship. Can you elaborate on what that means for gender parity? Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's critical. I think finding folks to mentor you as a woman, as a Black woman, as a person is very, very difficult. I know several of us have had some experiences that were pretty negative. I think talking about recentering what your success is. When you mentor someone, that is your success, right? So really inviting folks, even though we're in a crazy fast moving space, mentor people and get mentorship. That is how we create pipelines, connections, pathways for folks to join us at the table. When you're looking around, if it's a homogenous group, an age demographic, a race, heteronormative, then we're missing something, right? We haven't done our work appropriately if the spaces that we're in aren't diverse. So mentorship is one of the ways that we can absolutely do that. Elise already referred to anti-bias, anti-racism training, critically important. I mean, we are not finding ourselves in this time today without deep systems of oppression that have gotten us here, right? You hear people talking about systemic racism now, and they weren't so much, but we started this, 2 weeks before Mr. Floyd was killed. That wasn't mentioned in the introduction, but COVID's affecting us all incredibly differently. So we absolutely knew, none of us chose to be born into a racialized, stratified culture, but we are in one, and we've got to be very clear about what that is. And so white women have gained a lot of momentum around every civil rights action that women of color have ever pushed forward. It's really time for white women to own that ending racism is white people's work, and to lead and to recognize that you have such a tremendous opportunity in this time to not only celebrate a Kamala Harris and others, but to do it, to do the thing, to recognize that the suffragist movement left out women of color. We got our vote 45 years later, not quite the celebration that it's been heralded for everyone. Let's learn our history, learn that intersectional feminism is the deal, that 51% of women, we're 51% of the population, but if you break that down in terms of demographics, some of us are working a lot harder for all of us, and we really need you on board. We need it. We can't do it. We don't have the data or the numbers to do it without you. So training, education, leadership.
I 100% agree with everything that Kelly's saying, and I'm going to just kind of drill down into more of a micro view for myself. One of the most difficult things for me when I was starting in the cannabis industry was being able to find mentors that could mentor me in ways that would be effective for me as a woman of color who runs a largely LGBTQIA company with mostly other people of color and Black people. And it was so difficult to find that because they don't exist in large portions in the industry as it is right now. And so that was definitely detrimental to my business. I mean, it was detrimental to me too, because I was kind of flailing, but it was also detrimental to my business. Whereas for other businesses that are more in line with, white corporates, they were doing great because they had great mentorship from Pepsi and from Coke and from, Johnson & Johnson, like all those people that don't really connect with what I'm trying to do, not only for myself, but for my company, but also for the people that I knew in the informal market, also trying to get to the legal market. There would be such a transition of market share from 2/3 of it being in the illicit market to 1/3 being in the legal market. There'd be such a transition into the legal market if you had people who could mentor those folks, me, other small businesses, other companies of color into the legal market. We would see such a huge increase in revenue. And this is the thing I have to say that literally blows my mind, that why would you not want to do that? Why would you not want to center that? Why would you still want to be like crying and complaining about the $20 billion in the legal market and the $60 billion in the informal market and still talk about incarceration and misdemeanors instead of saying, okay, let's transition everybody over. Let's help everybody because it's more money and it's more leadership and it's more, for everybody. It's literally just more, like the MORE Act. I didn't mean to do that, but here you go. Anyway, that's what I was going to say.
I think that was such an interesting point. I think one of the things I've seen, and I'm curious if anybody wants to weigh in on this, is part of the challenge with finding a mentor is there's a lot of people, particularly women out there, who don't feel like they're experienced enough to contribute as a mentor. So I personally believe you don't need to be, a C-suite executive. You don't need to be in the industry for 10 years or 5 years even to be that mentor. So I would just encourage people to think openly and have the confidence to reach out to people who need mentorship. I feel like sometimes the younger generation, for example, have a lot to add from a technology perspective, from just understanding consumers better. I think, and that goes for Black, Brown, people of color, Indigenous people. I think it's incredibly important that everybody come to the table and realize that you have a lot to offer and you could be mentoring others. Okay. So Risa, you laid out a list of efforts that companies can do to improve pay equity, and you spoke about that a little bit earlier. But some of the efforts I thought was interesting was they just start with a hiring process. Can you spend a couple minutes talking about that as well?
I can. When we were talking about pay equity, pay equality, and we talk about the hiring process, that's been one of the critical junctures where pay goes really south really fast. Some of us may be experiencing labor markets where labor's tight. We start offering others higher paying jobs. We've already blown any kind of pay equity. There are a lot of things that when we think about the hiring process, we can take apart and put back together. We don't need a whole lot of help to do that. People are calling in today from all over the country, but different states have legislated for us salary bans. In many, many, many states, we can no longer ask applicants, how much money do you make? And if we're doing it right, we're very transparent about what a job pays. And we don't leave that confidence code on the table. Statistically, women won't negotiate the same way men will. It shouldn't have to be that way. I recently might have been out of work for a disability, and my pay slipped. Shouldn't have anything to do with my next job. So when we think about our hiring practices, if we all adopted the salary ban and we didn't ask the questions about historical compensation and spoke to the value of the job we were applying for, it'd be fascinating to see how quickly some of that gap gets closed because it shows up so fast in the recruiting process. So salary bans, don't be asking about what somebody makes. Talk about what it is you're able to pay. It keeps it very level, very fair, and it's much more equitable.
Mm-hmm.
Love that, Risa. Maybe building on that, Elise, I thought it was interesting that negotiating came into play with the equity ownership piece of this as well, not just with the compensation. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Risa, for pointing all of that out. Negotiating is something we do in every aspect of our life. Sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's in a relationship. Negotiation skills are incredibly important. And unfortunately, when you're talking about job salary or equity ownership, when you're starting a company, when you're divvying out how the equity is going to be handed out, we see across the board a huge disparity. There was an interesting study that you can find in the equity ownership paper where they looked at 180,000 employees, 6,000 companies, 15,000 founders. We were looking at that study looked at about $45 billion of total equity from many industries. And they found that 13% of founders were women, yet only 6% of the equity belonged to the women. That's in a negotiation right there, right? They're not negotiating enough in those moments. So that equates to $1.8 billion that female founders were getting versus $29.8 billion of male founders. And if you want to break that down to a dollar, that's 48 cents for every dollar. So yes, we're doing ourselves a disservice by not knowing our own value, but I would say that it's a structural issue if you're seeing that across the board. So it's on the people, it's on others to realize to not have these predatory practices and really look for the win-win And it's also on women to teach each other and themselves how to make sure that they're negotiating in their own best interest.
So we're going to break just a bit here from our structure. Arcviews reminded us to please type in any questions in the Q&A, and that we do have the breakout sessions afterward to answer all questions. Although I could not resist asking this question to this panel from my good friend Heather Cabot. So I'd love to pose this one to everyone. Would love to hear from panelists about how women in cannabis have been affected by the She Session during the pandemic, and thoughts about the Marshall Plan for Moms proposed by Reshma Sojani of Girls Who Code. So of course, as a technology executive, Girls Who Code is close and near and dear to our hearts. I can share that my COO, Ray Thompson, donates every little bit of, we have this incentive, employee peer incentive program, and he's always donating all of his points to Girls Who Code. So we love that organization. And I can also share that I am in a group of business leaders who have been discussing extensively since the beginning of the pandemic how much more impacted all of our women team members are, as well as those of us in our group where there were many people to whom as mothers more responsibility for the household was falling on them during the pandemic, even when many of these women are running massive and extensive businesses and enterprises. So I'd love for other panelists, Gail, to weigh in on that and potentially weigh in on the Marshall Plan proposed.
I'm actually going to see if anybody else wants to speak first on this one.
Any thoughts on the She Session during the pandemic, the impact that this has had on moms and women in the workforce, or on specifically the Risa?
So Jessica, I can't speak directly to the cannabis industry on this, but the She Session is real. McKinsey did a big study that we've probably all seen earlier this fall, and I don't think there's a whole lot of business that cannot truthfully look at their talent and not see women leaving at a faster rate, needing to cut back, struggling more with the balance. We probably don't have, probably none of us have, any good insider information on what's happening to mental health. But women are taking the biggest hit in this pandemic. They're taking the biggest hit. And again, intersectionality, as Kelly pointed out, just makes these gaps bigger, broader, worse, sorry, not better. But if you look at the data, and again, the McKinsey study did a great job of illuminating this, it's a problem, it's getting bigger, and it runs the risk of setting us back as women, as an economy, as a society, if not addressed.
And I just want to jump in there, Risa. Thank you for noting that for women of color, I mean, these issues mental health is horrible. We're carrying the weight of the world on our shoulders, culturally, inside of cannabis and outside of cannabis. And it's an enormous burden. And it behooves us to figure out how to do it differently. Who do we think our customers, workers are going to be? If we can't even care for our own families, it really puts us in a position where, not only are we not economically taking care of our families, but we are not able to contribute to community. We are not building generational wealth. We are falling deeply, deeply behind. And I can tell you for certain, mental health is in gigantic peril. If it wasn't before, if as a Black woman, you just walking down the street, feels pretty bad in this country, and then the economic hit after economic hit, and you funeral after funeral because of health inequities. And these are gigantic issues beyond cannabis, but we have this really unique opportunity to be in this moment, crafting this sector, learning from all others, and saying we actually could do things differently if we chose to, if we committed to.
So maybe thank you so much, Kelly. Maybe just one more thought on this, something that we've had in place in our company for a long time, and that might be something to consider just as a tool. We put together these, and all of the authors of our papers have put together these gorgeous toolkits that help to give us some actionable steps we can take on some of these topics. On this particular one, in terms of retaining female team members during the pandemic, it's not applicable to every position, and in our company, it is available, of course, to all team members, not only female team members, but we do have the concept for positions that qualify of a 75% work week option. And we measure them at 75% of their metrics. They make 75% of the pay. And we have had some women take advantage of that during the pandemic, and being able to, some mothers spend the time that they needed to spend with their families, and then we were able to keep them in the workforce. So maybe just one thing to add to the toolkit as we're moving along here. Gail, to you.
Elise, Christine, Risa, and Kelly, thank you so much for sharing your perspective today, but also for the past 10 months, getting to these papers to the place where I think they need to be. I learned over and over again from you in ways that I think are very impactful, and I think all of the participants in the webinar should also be grateful for sharing your thoughts and your perspectives. You guys are beautiful and brilliant, and I really appreciate being part of this. So thank you so much.
Thanks.
All right, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Kelly, I can't let you go quite yet, though. Move on to another conversation that I'm super excited about. So let's just move right into that. So everyone, prepare to continue to be amazed by the extraordinary Kelly Perez. Before this effort, Kelly, I considered you a friend. I loved dancing with you, and I was genuinely inspired by the change that you made in the cannabis industry and, quite frankly, in the world. Now going through this process, your brilliance and your perspective and your patience and your hard work has made me admire you even more than I thought I could have. Despite the fact that, quite frankly, it wasn't your responsibility to educate the team. And you might not have had the emotional energy because of the weight on your shoulders, as you so eloquently described. But regardless, you consistently worked to make sure we properly addressed the intersectionality of race and gender with gender parity. And likely we fell short, but it wasn't for lack of effort on your part. Personally, I'm grateful. These papers are so much better for your contribution and the contribution of several other amazing women on the team, a lot of whom you just heard from. But now the real work begins. So I want you all out there to hear kind of what's next, what our thoughts are for what's next, because this work is all of our responsibility.
I'm not quite feeling the warmth of the fireside chat, Gail. Can you turn it up?
Do you want me to love you a little more, Cal?
No, the heat. No, the love is
I don't know that I can love you that much more.
Thanks, Gail, for being so transparent that it was a truly difficult process, right? Because I took for granted that women in cannabis, all of us were kind of rooted in the historical context of cannabis and the weaponization of anti-Blackness and how this was just a tool. And that wasn't the truth. And because of the timing of the paper, Mr. Floyd was killed. Difficult times. I think I joined the first call we had, and I said, "Hi, I'm Kelly Perez. I'm Black. I'm a woman. Don't ask me to choose between them. If I have to choose, I'll choose Black because my life depends on it." And the next thing I said is, when white women are finished with racism, we will be done with it. And I don't mean that as a judgment. I mean it as, an incredible potential of power when you are united around things. And understanding gender inequity really does provide insight into other inequities. And that's really what folks are being called on to change right in this time. And so I don't know that I was able to do much influencing. I don't know changes that folks have because I don't have insight there. I know that it was difficult for me to say, hey, I want to mark and note intersectional feminism issues that we've had literally for 400 years, that it is very difficult for women of color, LGBTQIA, Indigenous women, Latinas, non-gender conforming folks, to be at these tables. And so I recognize that it's a privilege for me to be here, and you invited me here. So, and then I'm not that nice of a guest, right? That feels bad. I want to be kind and I want to be inclusive. And I have to say when things need improvement, because we will not get to gender parity if we are not getting to the underpinnings of systemic racism all oppression is interconnected, as well as the systemic raping of the earth. All oppression is connected. So none of us are free until we're all free. And so let's do something together that we're really proud of. And I think this is a start. It is a start.
I'm gonna, because this is a fireside chat and I don't have a list of questions, I wanted to key in on something you said where you felt like you weren't a nice guest. I believe also from the very first meeting, one thing that I said that I thought was very important was something I learned from Adam Grant, who is a thought leader in organizational psychology out of the University of Pennsylvania. And one of the most interesting thought leaders that I've read about in his book Originals, he talked about the value of authentic dissent. And he spoke about it in that when you can create an environment that allows for authentic dissent, it raises everybody up in a way that I think is incredibly impactful. So I don't think I was looking for nice in the paper. I was looking for quality, and I was looking to move the needle. I think we all wanted to actually, we spent quite a bit of time on this paper, and we really wanted to have an impact. And so I think it's a matter of what your goals are. First of all, you were so nice. You say everything so beautifully that
No, I'm not that nice. But you know what, Gail, I want to touch on it because as women, we are socialized to be nice. We are socialized to not create conflict. We are socialized to care for one another. And sometimes that prevents us from saying, I know every intent you have is to be inclusive and diverse, but as we see the diversity fall away, that's how we know we're not doing it. Because we haven't quite, even though we're noting the intersectional nature of oppression, we aren't correcting for it. And this is hard work. It's like the cutting edge of anti-racism is how do white leaders engage in their anti-racism work? And that shame resilience thing, I didn't make that up. That's social science talk. But what it means is we try to do the right thing. We identify ourselves as progressive or liberal or feminist, and yet we still get stuck in all the same patterns of white supremacy and patriarchy. Women can do that too, right? And it's super hard for us to correct for that. And we have to do it together because we don't actually have the numbers to do it alone. So I wasn't nice. I was self-protective. Like I took myself away when it was unsafe for me, it was toxic for me to be in a different space in my life. And I'm a Black woman with a lot of privilege and position, honestly. I have to represent for my sisters who aren't at the table and for the folks who won't get at the table. And I had to care for community members who were fighting for their lives in the street. And other folks, white women, get to have a different experience, right? That is very different than the visceral trauma of racialized America. So while I care very much about gender parity, my Blackness is always at the forefront because that is what's most in danger. Right. And so I know you're just being kind and polite, and I want to do that same thing. But more than that, I want us to organize together and say that with the 51% of us, and I'm not at all against men, you know, we could actually move things really forward because this was an incredibly privileged group of people, right? The fact that it was volunteer, not paid, and, you know, we were so privileged to be here. So we have a lot of responsibility on our shoulders.
I just want to acknowledge the fact that even when you did need to back away, you took an extraordinary amount of time to explain where you're coming from. I've never walked a day in your shoes. And I feel like a greater understanding was pretty powerful to me. I think about it all the time and a lot of the decisions I make. And I just hope that when people read these papers, they will also get a glimmer of that. There's a question I saw from the audience that I'd just love to get your thoughts on. Unfortunately, I think we could talk for 4 more hours, but after this, we probably will need to move on. But Erin Fay asks, how do we build trust and collaboration between white women and women of color? She said she notices a lot of skepticism, criticism, and frankly, bullying taking place that's blocking progress in this area. I thought that was a really interesting perspective and an accurate question.
Yeah, thank you, Erin, for that question. And I'm barefoot, by the way, Gail, walking in my shoes. I mean, honestly, one of the things I offered from this process was a curriculum for anti-racism for white leaders. And I have a vision that white women in cannabis will take that on. And it is a nuanced and very discreet piece of work. But there is work that white women, and I'm not responsible for it, it's work white women do, white people do with white people, because you have a lot of things to unpack. And there's harm done when that unpacking is done in the presence of people of color who are, again, carrying the burden of oppression. The work needs to be done. So there's white work that needs to be done. There's organizations like Surge, you know, standing up for justice for white people. Like, there are efforts, and to find those so that you can dig into what are the ways that you're holding up white supremacy and patriarchy in your own lives. And I'm not saying I'm immune to it at all. Like, you know, a Black woman, you know, called me out on a panel saying that I made her feel unprofessional. And everything in me wanted to defend myself. That wasn't my intent. That wasn't all the things that happened to you when I'm calling out. And I was like, no wonder white people don't want to do this. It feels horrible. But I gathered myself and I said, thank you for trusting me, for telling me that. I will do better. And then I had some time and I could say to her later, off camera, not in presence, not defend myself, say, that was not at all my intent, but I understand that you were harmed. I want to know how to do it better. Well, we worked together in front of 400 people the next day, and she shone like a star. And we weren't worse for our conflict, we were better. So white women, do your work. Come humbly with other women and non-gender conforming women and LGBTQIA people, and figure out, how do we move this forever, you know, forward together. Your interests and mine align in certain ways, and equity means we are providing the extra that folks need, since we did not start at the same threshold. And remember, we are cannabis. This is an industry built off the backs of Black and brown and sick people. We are here because other people paid with their lives. We have a great deal of responsibility here. Let's take it. Let's be courageous, be shame resilient, mess up, dust ourselves off, and do it again. And working together is actually how we figure out how to work together.
That's a perfect way to wrap it up. Although I'm sad to be wrapping up the session. I really think of this as hopefully the beginning of many, many dialogues, not just with us, but all of our participants and people at your companies. Is there any last words you have, Kelly, or can we just wrap it up with what you just beautifully said?
Just thank you for the opportunity, and please let's do our work, and let's note that the numbers are different because we have disaggregated the data. Got to throw that in there so we know what's happening among the different demographics of women. And let's aim really high. We have changed culture. We're cannabis. We change culture. Let's change it in a way that we are truly and deeply proud of what we do.
Fantastic. Thanks, Kelly. I really appreciate your time and your perspective, for sure, every day of the week.
Thank you.
All right, if I could welcome back Jessica, and also welcome Nancy Whiteman, Deborah Borchardt, and Gaynell Rogers. Hi.
Hi, ladies.
Hey, ladies. Hello.
So for this part of the discussion, we're focusing on the papers that are access to capital and product development and branding. So Jessica, you want to start us off?
Sure. Let's focus on maybe on the access to capital piece first. And gosh, I don't want to even begin. I've known both these women for such a long time, Deborah Borchardt, Gaynell Rogers. Gaynell, maybe just first starting with you, only because I met you first 11, maybe 12 years ago now. A little bit on you and your background, and then from Deborah.
Hi, everyone. That was a great first session, Gail. Thank you so much for that. Very grounding and important. My name is Gaynell Rogers. I'm founder and managing partner with Lori Ferrara and Lindy Snyder of Treehouse Global Ventures, of which we saw that there was a big black hole of funds, and some that were not socially conscious or gender equity conscious. And so that's why we started Treehouse. We have a long way to go, but we've made a good start, and we're very proud of the work, and we've had a lot of help along the way.
Gaynell and I met, I think we were the very first 2 female investor members of Arcview. Give a little shout out to our hosts here.
Well, actually, we were in the room with 12 people in Seattle when you and Amy did the first pitch for MJ Freeway, and we had one media person in the room, and that happened to be Roger Parloff of Fortune magazine, who was absolutely gobsmacked by what he was witnessing. which landed the first Fortune cover for the industry. So it's a great memory. Thanks for bringing that up. You guys were just absolutely ready, and it was very apparent.
Thanks, Gaynell. Deborah, can you give us a little background on you?
Absolutely. I am Deborah Borchardt. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Green Market Report, which is a cannabis financial news website. My background was in Wall Street. I was last a vice president at Bear Stearns, and I left to become a financial reporter, and I worked at thestreet.com with Jim Cramer for about 8 years. And I started covering cannabis back then at the Street when it was a little sketchy for the stocks, and it was considered almost something that was going to damage my career as a journalist, because there was a lot of stigma against cannabis back then. And even a lot of my colleagues questioned why I would even cover cannabis, and, you know, was giggled at behind my back. And then I felt like this was the biggest business story of the decade. A lot of mainstream media didn't feel that way. And really, even today, we still see the silly puns of what the mainstream media refers to with the cannabis industry. You know, this week, Bloomberg called GW Pharmaceuticals a pot drug maker. The company is getting bought for $7 billion, and they were called a pot drug maker. It's just crazy. So that's really my background. I'm real proud of Green Market Report and what we've done. We are 4 years live now.
Yay. Let me add to that, Deborah, for just a minute, in regards to the language defines thought. It was one of our biggest problems in the very beginning, 2008 and 9, when every reporter was using pot, weed, Mary Jane, drug, and it was just insane. And it still happens. I was talking to a CNBC reporter yesterday who said, I am the only reporter on the network that uses cannabis. Everybody else uses pot. It drives her insane. So this is still a problem, and we still continue to police the media about language every day.
So circling to our papers, thanks, Gaynell, what key actionable takeaway from your paper do you think could have the most impact on companies that have not historically had gender parity but are willing to work for it?
You want me to take that?
Sure, please.
Well, I mean, this is a larger conversation. However, what I will say is the key points is to read it like 3 times, because some of the stories and the resources in there, when I read white papers of any industry, it always takes me a while to get it to sink in. And there's a lot of data in the paper that gives you some great resources in regards to mentorship, how to build your brain trust, what the real numbers are, how to build connectivity, and really about collaboration and what it means and what it has meant in some of the stories that we tell. Then there's an actual kind of ABC toolkit on the ask, the attitude, the language, the perspective, and digging deeper into structure of financing and lending and getting investment that people don't understand when they walk into it. So having the language and the glossary is really important. And I think a lot of people will learn a lot from the stories that we're able to tell through these papers.
Thank you
And I
so
would
much.
add to that, one of the things that I really took away from this report that we worked on was, you know, it was really hard to wrap some numbers around women receiving capital in the cannabis industry, because there really isn't any hard data. And I talked with Sumit Mehta from Mazzucchelli, and he kind of helped me work through a formula where, after we worked these numbers, we realized that almost 99% of the funding that is happening in the cannabis industry is going to male-owned companies, almost 99%. And I feel that if people read this report, they'll start to understand that when we say, hey, the women-owned companies aren't really getting a lot of capital, we're trying really hard, we're doing all the right things, we're still not getting the money. And now we can kind of point to some of these numbers and say, you know what, here's the support for that. It isn't just that we're complaining or that we feel like we're getting the short end of the stick. It's really true. We really aren't getting the money. And what we noticed when we were writing the report, as Gail mentioned with all the stories, is that a lot of the women and some of the women that are here on this panel and that help write this report were going to venture capitalists and private equity and such and saying, here's my business plan, here's my deck, and it's pristine, just great numbers, revenue, earnings, history. I mean, just coming up with these wonderful decks and getting told no. And it was baffling that we were looking at male-owned companies that had just an idea or had major problems with their company. And here's the checks. The checks are flowing in. And so that was, that was so upsetting for us to see in our networks. So it was really important for us to put that in writing in black and white and say, this isn't just things that we feel or think. It's true, it's happening, and we want people to understand this is happening so that we can correct it.
Starts with data-driven decisions.
It is, and also, in the early days of Arcview, they used to say at the beginning of every forum, we're here to build a new kind of industry. And here we are talking about this 10, 11 years later, and we haven't built a new kind of industry. And that's why I'm hoping that we can really make some noise with the data that are in these papers, because this gives real black and white facts of what has happened. Same thing happened to the tech industry, and it needs to stop. And it's a financial and political will problem that we need to address with the male financial culture. And that is why in the chat I see more men need to be included in this conversation, and they do, especially men who work at large financial institutions who actually don't have a clue on how to start gender parity in their financial institutions. And maybe we're here to tell them how.
Thank you all so much. I think we want to go ahead and wrap up the fantastically interesting and super important access to capital. A lot of us know that if it doesn't start with money, it's really hard to go anywhere in this industry or in any industry for that matter. But I'd love to hear more about product development and branding. So Nancy, could you please introduce yourself?
Absolutely. I'm Nancy Whiteman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Wana Brands. Wana Brands is North America's #1 edibles brand. And we operate in 12 markets, 11 states in the United States plus Canada. And I was so honored to be asked to be part of this initiative. I'm kind of one of the OG of the edibles companies. We started in Colorado in 2010. And it was really interesting because back in 2010, there actually were a lot of women in the business. And then over the years, I progressively watched women get sidelined, in some cases forced out of their companies, in other cases sidelined because of the topic that we were just talking about, lack of access to capital. And what I realized is that cannabis, as it became quote unquote big business, began to mirror some of the historical patterns that we've seen in industry in our country, which is that there is unequal access to capital. And so, Gail, I'm gonna let you sort of tee up with the questions that you want to ask me here, but there is a deep connection between access to capital, women in senior leadership positions, and the impact on product development and branding.
So I felt like this paper was a little bit different than every other paper that we had. I think that this one was highly focused on the consumers themselves and what they're looking for. And I thought that it was such an interesting angle. So maybe if you could start by telling us, how does product development and branding fit into the overall discussion on gender parity?
Yeah, thank you. Gail, that's a great question. And I do think that gender equity is a little bit different flavor when we talk about it in the context of product development and branding. I don't personally feel that the right way to judge gender equity in the area of product development and branding is by going out and counting the number of brands that are specifically focused on women. And I'm going to talk about why that is in a moment. I do think about it in terms of whether brands are effectively meeting the needs of women cannabis consumers. And so for me, this is less about sort of a moral imperative, the same way that some of the other topics that we covered truly are moral imperatives. And it really has to do more with business strategy and savvy. What I deeply believe is that brands that don't do a good job of understanding women as cannabis consumers are way less likely to develop products that are appealing to women and to meet their needs. And I would also venture a strong educated guess that the odds of success go way down in terms of meeting the needs of female consumers if there's no female leadership in the senior levels of the company. So this again ties back to what we're talking about in terms of diversity of hiring, women in the C-suite, and access to capital. So when we structured this paper, Gail, we really divided it into two chunks. The first area, as kind of a common theme that we're talking about here, is very data-driven. We wanted to really look at some of the common myths and misperceptions about women in cannabis, and also some of the truth, and to ground them in actual data. And then the second section really looks at some of the different business models and strategies that brands can employ to reach female consumers more effectively.
So I'm sure you mentioned data, and I'm sure that we all have our ideas about what a cannabis consumer looks like. But if you could just weigh in on some of the misconceptions and truths that you discovered through the research on this paper.
Yes, well, you know, this is actually a really fascinating topic. First of all, let me give a shout out for this webinar to Headset. For those of you who don't know Headset, they're one of the leading analytic companies in the cannabis space, and they generously provided some information from their research on female cannabis consumers for use in this webinar. So thank you to them. The first point that I want to make is that women actually account for 32% of cannabis revenue. 32%. A full third of every dollar that's being spent on cannabis products are being spent by women. And that number is actually growing on a spending basis more rapidly than men. It's growing 9% more rapidly than men. So right there, we can see that brands who ignore women as cannabis consumers really do it at their own peril. They're missing an enormous chunk of the market and a growing part of the market. But as we get to this kind of misperception or myths piece of it, one of the persistent ones that I hear all the time, and it's particularly relevant for us because of the space that we're in as an edibles company, is that women favor non-inhalable products over inhalable products. But if you look at the data that I'm mentioning, what you really see is that if you ask women what their preferences are, 42% selected flower as their preferred method of consumption. And then vaping was just under 20%. And then came edibles at about 14%. So right there, we have just a great example where if companies don't understand what the actual consumption preferences of women are, they could very much choose a strategy that isn't based in reality, but it is more based in their own particular perception. Now, despite the fact that 2/3 of the women state that inhalable methods of consumption are their preference, it actually is true that women over-index for edibles, topicals, and tinctures. And what that means by over-indexing is that relatively more of the cannabis wallet is spent on those forms of consumption versus men's share of the cannabis wallet. So this information is extremely interesting, sort of at a high level. It's a lot more nuanced when you start breaking into specific variables such as the age of the women, the dosages that they like, the formulations that they like. But there is truth that women, in fact, are a terrific market for some of the non-inhalable forms of consumption. Another very interesting data point, which I thought was again, really leads directionally to what a brand might want to do, is the fact that women over-index on smaller pack sizes of 50 milligrams and less. So this really suggests that brands need to understand things like dosage preferences and overall tolerance levels if they're going to develop products that are actually meeting women's needs and preferences. So those are a couple of the things that I'd point to, Gail.
So this paper was able to be very data driven. I do want to acknowledge that many of the other papers had a real challenge getting data specifically related to the BIPOC and LGBTQIA+ communities. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there for some of the data companies, or possibly even a new data company, to come out and really analyze that data so that we can make informed decisions. The different communities out there have a huge, they vote with their wallets, right? So we need to be able to have that data to run our businesses. But that being said, since you did have the data on the consumer side, could you talk about some of the different strategies that companies can employ to reach women consumers?
Absolutely. So I want to just restate what I said at the beginning, which is that I don't think gender equity is necessarily a function of how many brands are immediately identifiable as quote unquote female brands. We have to put brands in the context of where this market is. This is still a new market. It's a nascent market. What we have is a situation where we have still a relatively small total market size versus the entire population. And we have a distribution channel, that being dispensaries, where we have very limited shelf spaces. So dispensaries are always in the position of sort of weighing where they're going to get the velocity that they want from a given product or product line, with their need to address sort of the more specific needs of particular target markets. And I saw somebody made a comment in the chat, which I completely agree with. Women are not a target market. That is way too large a category to sort of blanket them. We can't talk monolithically about what women want or what women need. Any good marketer, of course, would go a lot deeper than that. And so I'm not suggesting that women all sort of respond as a group. So really what we have to do then is kind of step back, if you will, from, the idea that we're counting up the number of female brands as some kind of proof of something, and actually think about what strategic alternatives companies have. The first business model that I'll address is actually one that my own company employs. So, Wanna Brands, I would describe us as being gender neutral in terms of our product and also in terms of our visual branding and our marketing. And what I mean by gender neutral is that we don't make a particular effort to gear our products towards women, nor do we make a particular effort to gear them towards men. Just as, a pasta brand or a beverage brand, you don't necessarily pick up the box and say, oh, this spaghetti speaks to me as a woman's brand. Our products are equally popular with men and women. And in fact, that is what the Headset data actually shows about gummies, which is our lead category, is that gummies actually are indexed equally with men and women. So for a company like mine to say we're going to be a female-focused brand would be a bad business decision. We would be cutting out half of our target market, right? So this is what I would call strategy number one, which is brands that don't particularly focus on a particular gender, but like Wanna is also very careful not to alienate women. And also we try not to alienate men. We try not to alienate any future customers with how we brand. And we do keep in mind women's preferences around dosages and packaging and formulations in mind as we do our product development. The second business model that I would talk about is a model where the products themselves are gender neutral. And by that, I mean, chocolate is chocolate and vapes are vapes. There's nothing that makes a chocolate more or less appropriate for men or for women in most situations. But by virtue of the branding, the visual branding and the marketing that the company has used, they have made a strategic decision to focus their brand on women. I can give a variety of examples of this. I think Autumn Brands is a very popular flower brand that's very overtly targeted towards women. Garden Society, lovely, beautiful branding, flowers. It's clearly targeted towards women. House of Saka, Kikoka Tea. All of these are beautiful brands that are visually focused on women. And that's a legitimate strategy also, to say that we think that there is actually a market for products that are specifically focused to women. The third model that I'd like to mention is even nichier, and that are products and brands that are designed specifically and in fact only for women. I would say Quim, if you're familiar with Quim, they make a line of vaginal products, lubricants, vaginal health, sexual health products. Those products are for women specifically. Eve Cannabis is a Canadian-owned brand. Blasiva is a brand that's actually was started by some women OBGYNs. So these brands are niche-y, and because they are niche-y, in the short run, they probably have some challenges, right? Because dispensaries, again, have to go back to that balancing act that we were talking about a minute ago with, I want products that meet the needs of very specific markets, yet I need a certain velocity to justify putting them on the shelves. And then the fourth model that we looked at really is moves away from plant touching businesses and looks at ancillary businesses that focus on women. I would put Elementa in this category. They do cannabis education for women. There's a company called Milk Makeup that makes a Kush mascara. There's a company called Jane Parade, which is a Black female cannabis-owned accessories businesses. Now, these businesses are also sort of in the more specific category, but again, because they're not plant touching, they're not limited to being sold through dispensaries. So they may have some broader distribution options. But Gail, those would be 4 examples of really distinctly different business strategies that different brands can employ to reach female consumers.
It's so interesting. I really appreciate you sharing that many specifics about the data that you've seen. And I think for companies who are looking to pitch and get access to capital, just to connect the two conversations, I think understanding your customer base, understanding your future revenue streams is an incredibly important part of the pitch process, even in order to get access to capital to be able to build your brand. So I just want to thank Gaynell, Deborah, and Nancy so much for your time the past 10 months, as well as today, to share the information that you gleaned and your perspectives on these papers. So thank you guys so much.
Welcome. Thank you.
Right. If I could now welcome Jean and Kim, and I'm going to hand it over to you in 1 second, but I have to first thank you so much for your extraordinary team who, quite frankly, in the 11th hour took over this project and worked miracles to make this happen in a way that was extraordinary and exemplar. It was just an example of how a team could work together to get a project done in a beautiful, impactful way. So thank you so much. And I'm going to sign off and listen to you guys chat.
Thank you so much, Gail. And yes, we do have quite the incredible team here, but it's also a really important topic and one very close to my heart. And Miss Jean Sullivan, who I get a chance to have just a really nice, candid, open, fireside conversation. So for those of you who don't know me, so my name is Kim Kovacs. I'm the CEO of the Arcview Group. I had the honor of stepping into some pretty big shoes, Troy Dayton shoes last year. And, but I have to say a lot of the reason that I decided to join Arcview as CEO was because of Miss Sullivan, and having known Jean in our prior lives in the technical space. And full disclosure, I pitched my company to her and she said no, but I got some great points from her as to why. And so I have a high degree of respect for women, especially in our industry, who fund companies. And that has always been a life goal of mine, is to not just be an entrepreneur. So I've had 6 different startups, but I'm also an angel investor. And I've made 17 investments through my own company, through one of my investment holding companies. And about 80% of them are in women-run businesses, women-founded companies. So part of what I'd like to talk about today, but I'm going to have Jean first introduce herself, is about writing that check. because without women as investors, we're not going to change this dynamic. Hi, Jean.
Hello, Kim, and thank you for stepping into Troy's shoes, only they were Louboutins and you're dancing backwards, so thank you for that. I am Jean Sullivan. I am privileged to be here with all of you, and Kim and I hope to build on some of the rich discussion we just heard. We just delighted to have you and to be able to lead the way on this kind of conversation. So I am a longtime venture capital investor. I'm part of the Arcview team, which has been so fabulous. Kim, do you believe it was 1 year ago this week, we had our Arcview Santa Monica. That's the last time I even was on an airplane or a live kind of event. I miss all that, but certainly through your leadership, we're here digitally, and that's been very exciting and very intimate. So I'm thrilled to be able to build investment platforms for our investor network. And certainly we have a D&I, a strategy. As Kim just said, writing the check, the research has already been done on that. We know why women have a hard time getting their companies financed. You need women investors, women GPs who get it, or at least men who have that lens. So I love to share that long before even though I'm all in as on cannabis and cannabis reform, I have been a fierce advocate for women for more than 25 years in my entire business career. So those are some of the stories we both want to share with you today.
So Jean, why don't you start? Why don't you talk about, co-founding a women-owned venture fund, which, by the way, for those of you who don't know, I'm not going to say the name. Jean can do that if she wants to, but this was a very large fund. This was actually one of the preeminent fintech funds that were there. When you would look at the sort of who's who, and I had a software company, your company was ranked there at the top, and so impressive. So tell us about that.
So what's so fun to share is that we did co-found a women-owned venture fund, but here's my first time story of even being aware. We didn't even know or realize we were 3 women, and we did have our 1 trophy male. We didn't even understand what that was or the importance of that. But what's so fun, this is 1998. So I started getting a phone call, hey, Jean, or my other women partners, will you speak at this conference or that about being one of the few women GPs? So of course I set out and I did the research. I went, what? Do you realize that 20 years ago, there were only 2 women as CEOs of Fortune 500 companies? Now today, amazing, we actually have 37 women. It's the highest it's ever been. That's only 7.4%. Pretty pathetic, wouldn't you think, Kim? I mean, really. But then my research showed, this is way back, not last week, that we do make 85 to 95% of the household decisions, right? All the healthcare, all the clothing, the cars, the house, but we are nowhere in the executive suite or even driving the compensation discussions. I said, what? What's with that? See, I didn't even understand that. Mm-hmm. And I said, I need to fix that. I need to do something about that. And so and then I'm shocked to continue to share, as we've mentioned earlier, women only get 2.2% of all venture capital financing. Yeah. What? No, we know why. I shared that already. You have to have women who get it, who open the door, who say, come on in. I want to hear from you. I want to hear what you have. I want to understand your product as it serves a marketplace that's needed. Kim, what was your wake-up call? How did it happen for you?
Well, I had sort of a couple wake-up calls. For some reason, that lens just never really hit me. I maybe, put it to the side, or I wasn't really thinking, oh, I'm a woman, going in and raising money. And for my first startups, I'd raised over $50 million. And I was walking into another one where I was looking for another 45 million. And this is in the oil business, Jean. And this was back in 99, 2000. We were doing a clean tech fuel additive, so here I go to Houston. I'm going to like a capital conference for oil business, and I'm running late because I'm trying to find like parking and doing all this stuff in Houston. And I'm wearing a skirt. I'm wearing a suit with a skirt. and I walk into this conference and there's probably 1,000 people there. And because I'm a little late, you know, the door opens and I'm kind of like, you know, trying to sneak in, but literally every head just turned and looked at me, and they were almost entirely, there's probably 2 other women in the room, but they were wearing pants. Right. And so I was like the only woman like standing in a skirt, and I felt so uncomfortable. It was the first time I became like aware that there was this massive difference in, you know, who I thought I was, and like, you know, sort of my equality, you know, in this space. And like I said, I'd raised already a ton of money. I mean, I wasn't uncomfortable raising money or, you know, asking for that check, but I just felt really uncomfortable being a woman in that particular moment. And it was really quite an eye opener. And then the second one for me, so when I had my software company that I started in 2006, we were on the Inc. 500 list for 3 years in a row. And the third year, I was asked to speak at the Inc. 500 conference, and they wanted me to talk about this really crazy thing. I had 3 women on my board, which was the first time that they had seen a private company, software company have 3 women on its board of directors. And I was like, what? What do you mean? You've never seen that before? This is like something new. This is 2006. I'm like, this isn't, you know, 1976. And I was just really surprised again that that was an issue, because I just wasn't like, you know, front of mind for me. And I thought, of course there's more women on boards. And then when I started doing my research too, I recognized, like you did, right? There weren't.
And
Those are my 2 aha moments.
And it's so important. And see, what's so critical is that we know that the whole tech world, life sciences world, non-cannabis world, they have not done this right. We have a chance in our cannabis industry to understand the issues and to discuss those issues, show the men. It takes men to understand this. I put this in the chat. I did the research on this. Do you realize there are 60% of the men who do want to make change? They just have no idea what the best practices should be. There's 20% of men who are aware, awake, and doing something, and there's 20% that don't even care. But the research shows when they find out in their own organization that there's a, let's say, a pay disparity, they'll fix it. So that's some of the work. And so you, Kim, have been part of wonderful groups. Speak to some of that, the work you've done, Golden Seeds, all that.
So, you know, I think from that Inc. 500 experience, one of the things that I decided right then and there, because I did have, you know, 2 other women plus myself on my board at Optionees. And I said, you know, as soon as I make it, as soon as I sell this company and I have a chance to be an investor, I'm going to be an investor. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, because we can sit here all day and say, well, there aren't enough VCs and there's not enough women in, you know, across the table from us and everything else. We are across the table. We can't keep saying there's no woman across the table for me. You can be across the table. You can actually be across the table right now today. You don't have to be an accredited investor. You don't have to have, you know, super high net worth. You can go in and crowdfund on a company today. So I would like to make a challenge to everybody in the chat. And I want to know how many of you out there have invested in a woman-run company. And if you have, I want you to put your name in the chat, because to me, that's changing the dynamic. So I started with this group called Golden Seeds. So one of my women investors who was on my board at Optionees, she was a member of Golden Seeds. It really was eye-opening. 350 women investors hailed out of New York. Jean, that's how we first met, same office you were in. And to me, that was such an amazing thing to see these women investing in women-run companies. And they didn't start with 350 members. They started with just a handful. And what they decided is, we're going to write the goddamn check, okay? And they did. And they started investing in women-run companies. And from that point in 2006, when they started, there were 3% of the women were angel investors. It is now almost 30%. So almost 30% of angel investors in the United States are women.
And that's pretty exciting number, that cohort is the fastest growing cohort of angel investors. I love that. So here's what happened to me. I said, I got to figure out what the heck's going on. This is over the last 25 years. So I became very involved with Astia. I'm on their board of trustees still, and I really care about them. And this past week, we just did our first close for a fund. MasterCard invested a very large amount of money, focused on women-founded companies. And that is so exciting. And really so care about that. And we have funded more than 150 rounds of women-owned companies. So that's been in a non-cannabis world. But then I have been part of, for many years, the Women's Leadership Board at the Harvard Kennedy School. They are responsible and have published the seminal research on what in the hell is going on. This amazing woman, Iris Bonet, Swiss, she is the academic dean there, as well as the head of this women's public policy group. And she has written the most amazing book called What Works? Well, what the heck does work? She has written about it as well as several others. I'm very close to another woman that I was on the board with, Barbara Annis, who has written 5 books on the subject. And it is about things like sponsorship. I put this in the chat too. Mentorship is important, but the word sponsorship has a little bit more gravitas, where men and women can seek out those women who want to learn more, who want to grow, support them in their failures, support them in their successes, teach them the ropes, promote them. That's more than just mentoring somebody. That's bringing them up. It needs men and women who understand that. And so I think that's really critical. So there are real practical things that we can all do to overcome this. Barbara Annis, my friend who is such an authority on this, she loves the word unconscious bias. That is often what's going on, that people just aren't aware. Just like I shared vulnerably to you, I didn't even understand the gender issues. I understand them. And so that means if you care, that you do something about it. And so Kim, let's share with our wonderful group here, what's your commitment on this gender parity area?
So my commitment is providing this platform and other platforms like the Women Inclusion Network, and even renaming it from the Women's Investor Network, even though I'm very passionate about investing. To me, it's about inclusion. We cannot have the pendulum swinging any more than we've already seen it. You know, we don't need to have an all-girls club. We need an inclusion club, and we need to really lead by example. And so when I said that 80% of my investments were women-run or founded companies, the other 20 are just as important to me too, because they're addressing issues, societal issues, they're addressing big problems that I like to see fixed. And to me, it's about, you know, who that team is and how do they embrace inclusion versus, you know, whatever gender they were born with or decided to come into. You know, to me, it's about really providing a platform and a place, and not judging us on whether or not we have a manel one day and then a female panel the next day. It's all about blending this together and creating the space that brings in the best companies. That's the other thing I want to make a mention of. You know, just because, you know, Golden Seeds is funding or I was funding women-run companies doesn't mean that I would fund any idea started by a woman. It had to be a really solid. I mean, you're competing for venture dollars against all kinds of people. And so to me, don't come to me with a half-baked plan or, no offense to swimsuits, but no new swimsuit manufacturing idea. And, you know, it just, I'm a tech investor, okay? I invest in technology. Come to me with a really awesome kick-ass technology idea, and you will have an audience with me.
Yes, and mine to share is to continue to open the doors for women and diverse entrepreneurs and business owners, access to capital, the education, so they know, just like you said, Kim, how to present, how to package. In fact, we at Arcview have those kinds of programs now, thanks to your great ideology. So that education to create the connections. Hey, join us as an investor if you so wish in this wonderful fund that we have going already, that the investors are actually part of the decision making. It's a wonderful hybrid between an angel group and a classic fund. And I want to continue to seek and find women founders, because that door is open to you. And if it's not right for us, I work hard to find another door for you. That is my ongoing commitment. I am dedicated to that and have been for 30 years. It's so much fun to share this passion. Okay, we're over back to Gail. Thank you all.
Thanks, Jean.
And Jessica as well.
Hi, all. So what a productive conversation, and hopefully we are just getting started. with this conversation. It just maybe getting a little personal here in conclusion, and I shared this in the papers and in the conclusion I wrote, that 25 years ago, I was just starting a career in technology, and I believed I was at the beginning of a wave of change. And sadly, there's actually a lower percentage of women in technology today than 25 years ago. Today, we see a similar story beginning to repeat with cannabis. We can do better. We will do better. Study after study support that gender diversity, as well as all other forms of diversity, are good not only for consumers, but also for business. Diversity encompasses different points of view, which support innovation, a critical success component for our rapidly evolving cannabis industry. If we understand the value of diversity in the workforce, how do we start? It starts with each of us, and we hope to provide in these papers a wealth of practical tips and tools that are a way to get started. To Jean's point just a few minutes ago, we have support from 60% of males. The question is how to start. Hopefully these tips and tools provided in the papers can be a jumping off point. And more importantly, however, beyond undertaking some big initiative, is the commitment to take just one small action to help a woman succeed. Lives are changed one introduction, one mentoring session, one email at a time. 3 years ago, I committed to at least 3 pro bono mentoring sessions a month for women, a commitment I maintain today, and at least one of those every month as a woman of color. I invite you to participate in the One Woman Challenge. The commitment is simple. Commit to helping one woman in some way. All those actions may seem like drops in the bucket, but all these drops can create the swell of real change. And just thank you again to NCIA and Arcview for providing the platform to do these papers, and Gail for your incredible leadership through this process.
Thanks, Jessica. I so appreciate your perspective and your kind words to me. I just really quickly wanted to thank all of you participants for attending. I hope you will also get a ton out of the next half hour, where you can have an opportunity to ask a lot of the questions that maybe you didn't get a chance to ask, and also some new questions about how we can help you. Every one of you can work to build a culture that fosters diversity, discussion, and dissent. And no matter who you are, what your background is, or your gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, age, or experience, we do hope that these papers will inspire you to encourage yourself and others to help build the new foundation for the cannabis industry. And it's hopefully going to be in a foundation that's built upon gender parity and diversity. Thank you so much. Laura, do you want to take it from here?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gail and Jessica. Just to wrap things up, we launched a poll just to gather some of your thoughts on today's webinar and important topics for you going forward. We always like to hear from you. Please make sure to visit arcviewgroup.com/NCIA. We're having a rolling launch of these papers. So over the next 2 weeks, you'll see these papers on arcviewgroup.com/NCIA. We have 2 papers up right now. Getting Started bundle is available. It includes the foreword from Jean Sullivan, the author's bios, collection of definitions, and paper introduction. The first bundle is also available. It's Gender Parity in the C-Suite, and it includes an accompanying toolkit in writing your gender parity statement. If you'd like to learn more about our Women's Inclusion Network, as Kim mentioned, please visit arcviewgroup.com/win. Our Women's Inclusion Network focuses on networking and education for women, with over 130 women so far, and we'd like to see more. We recently launched an interactive mentorship workshop series that takes place every other Monday to answer all of the questions that you have in this area. Please also log on to our virtual after party. So you'll need to leave this webinar and log in through the Zoom meeting link in your email inbox. The authors will lead an interactive discussion on their topic and different breakout rooms. So we'd like to thank the authors and the contributors that made these white papers possible. And a special thank you to Gail and Jessica for co-authoring and their involvement every step of the way. We at Arcview Group feel strongly that the issues addressed in this paper need to be changed in our industry, and we're grateful for our partnership with NCIA for making the papers and toolkits available. We look forward to seeing you at our next Arcview event, and please share the links to download the white papers as they'll be available throughout the year. Thank you again for joining today.